far past the busy shipping routes, where a gray swell heaves slow and steady beneath a fog that has begun to lift, a ship glides on with no one to steer her. The canvas is spread. Her timbers groan the way they always do, leaning into a breeze that obeys no living hand now. Cold has crept into the lanterns. The wheel shifts a touch, then holds, then drifts once more, as if some watchful spirit kept its post in a place where no post is kept. This is the way these accounts tend to open, not with a hull torn apart, but with a craft that ought to brim with life and instead lies wholly, unaccountably bare. Across the centuries, those who sail have stumbled on ships of just this kind and felt their skin prickle up the length of an arm. A ship is supposed to hold a small, drifting world inside it, packed with voices and habit, and the warm scent rising from a galley. Coming upon one adrift in stillness, riding chill spray with not a single soul, troubles something far down in the mind. Such are the ghost ships, and the tales of them are sown from things that truly happened, which over years of retelling settle gently into legend. Some came to light with the cloth spread and a meal abandoned partway through. Others bore faint hints that only thickened the puzzle. A handful seemed to fall clean out of the ledger, gone from one decade and surfacing again, still adrift, in the next. For the most part, these are not stories of the otherworldly. They take their shape from tempests and dread, from solitude and the immense unknown of the open water. They rise out of a world in which one slight choice might ripple across entire lives, and in which the truth could float off as softly as a hull sinking past the skyline. If drifting through these quiet histories helps the day loosen its grip, you might let this little harbor of stories know with a gentle tap, or leave a soft word below for the next traveler who cannot sleep. It costs nothing, and it helps these calm voyages reach the people who need them most. For now, though, there is nothing to do and nowhere to be. Let your shoulders lower, let the breath go slow, and let the tide of the telling carry you on. Take one such wanderer that has never surrendered its mystery. Early in 1921, an enormous 5-masted schooner called the Carroll A. Deering was discovered stranded on Diamond Shoals off Cape Hatteras, her canvas still spread as though she intended to carry on. By the time help at last drew near her, the crew had simply disappeared. There were no bodies, no plain mark of any fight, nothing but a deserted ship driven hard against the shoals, and a riddle that has never been laid to rest. It is the sort of finding that appears to defy any answer, and it took its place in a long succession of such puzzles, stretching far back across the years. The most celebrated among them came to pass in December of 1872. A brigantine out of Britain, the Dei Gratia, fell in with a ship acting oddly upon the Atlantic, holding a course that wandered, nearly without aim. That ship was the Mary Celeste. Her sails were still set, and her hull still sound, and yet once a boarding party clambered over, not a single captain, crew member, or passenger could be found. In the hold, the freight of industrial alcohol lay undisturbed. Items of worth stayed exactly where their owners had set them down. There was food, and there was fresh water yet aboard, and the ship's documents were largely in proper order. The lifeboat alone was absent. Her master, Benjamin Briggs, had put to sea with his wife beside him and their small daughter, and every one of them slipped from the world and left behind not one clear word. That single tableau, a seaworthy ship cleared of every person, did more than anything else to forge our present notion of a ghost ship. A few hold that the explanation rested in that very freight. Among the 1,701 casks of denatured alcohol stowed below, 9 turned up empty afterward. On closer study, it seems vapor escaping from those barrels may have ignited in one quick flare of gas, alarming, yet leaving no burn mark, and that a panicked crew, dreading that the entire ship might go up, dropped the small boat over and pulled away to ride out the threat at a careful remove. Should a rope have then snapped, or a gust come up, they would have found themselves stranded, while the Mary Celeste glided calmly along without a soul aboard. It remains no more than a guess, fenced in with doubt. Yet it reveals how a commonplace danger might clear a deck within minutes. And having been cleared, a ship does not always go under. Surrendered to the wind, the current, the weather, a hull can press on well after the final crewman has departed. It turns into a sort of roaming engine, still in motion though nobody grips the wheel. The most renowned of these wanderers turned up hundreds, even thousands of miles from the spot where their stories first unraveled. A forsaken vessel might slip across crowded sea lanes, surface again beside some far shore, or appear to climb back out of nothing whole months afterward. Mariners grasped this, which is why an odd shape upon the skyline could send a chill through them. It might prove a ship belonging to a different season, a different ocean, a different calamity altogether. In some instances, the wanderers endured so long that more than a single generation claimed to spot them, until a bare hull had outlasted the very recollection of the crew it once bore. A ghost ship called for nothing otherworldly to be born. The record forged them over and over by way of plain human disaster. Within the polar seas, ships were sealed so utterly within the ice that the people aboard had no recourse but to trudge off and abandon them. In time of war, a blaze or the strike of a torpedo or sheer fright might drive sailors over the rail into the boats, while the ship obstinately held above water. Sickness brought a dread all its own. For when plague or cholera broke loose, the harbors grew fearful of tainted hulls, and even a whisper could turn a drifting craft into something monstrous. And there was mutiny, the most ancient terror of any commander, for if order shattered far from any shore, a ship might press onward with no rightful command, or with not one person remaining. Every path arrived at the identical unnerving image, a sound craft traveling over open water once the human tale inside it had run out. The waves never inquired why the deck stood empty. They merely bore the ship along. Well ahead of the picture house or any modern fright, those who sailed already kept a specter of their own. The Flying Dutchman, it was told, would loom up within tempests, lit by an eerie glow, never permitted to reach harbor, doomed to wander the seas without end. In contrast to the Mary Celeste, her case had never been any recorded abandonment. She belonged to legend, molded down the generations by terror and weather and the vast solitude of distant crossings. And that is exactly the reason she swelled so mighty. The story made the sea itself a spinner of tales. A faraway ship in fading daylight, a hull caught half through the spray, a shimmer wavering close to the skyline, each might harden into a portent from some farther realm. The account spread out of sailors' mouths into writing and pictures, into opera and the broader fancy, until it came to stand for every unaccountable sighting upon the water. What stays longest in the genuine reports, though, is no shattered plank nor blast of cannon. It is everyday living broken off. Time and again the chronicles of forsaken ships note a meal partway made, a galley yet holding warmth, possessions set down precisely where someone intended to fetch them. These tiny particulars lend the puzzle a nearness that grips, for they hint that whatever arrived did not play out over hours both slow and hushed. It struck swiftly enough to sever the cadence of the day. And a life upon the sea moved by cadence. The watches turned over, mealtimes were kept, the same chores circled round and round. To come upon those patterns cut through at the middle is far more chilling than any wreck could ever manage. The vacant deck declares the people gone. The unfinished meal declares they meant to return. A number of these ships drifted farther than many a master ever sailed on purpose. The flows of the North Atlantic and of the North Pacific are no haphazard things. They are vast traveling engines, mighty enough to bear ice and wreckage and, now and then, entire ships over staggering spans of water. A craft cast off in one quarter might be sighted later off a wholly separate shore, turned from a thing of work into a rumor fitted with rigging. In an odd fashion, certain ghost ships rounded off a last passage greater than any they had been fashioned to undertake. Up in the high north, a ship might disappear and still not disappear in the least. The Arctic keeps its past suspended. Ships seized within the pack ice were not invariably ground to pieces straight away. A few held fast in place, preserved by cold and gloom and the unhurried clutch of the frozen sea, turning less into wrecks than into shut chambers out of an earlier age. Garments and implements, tins of food and books, the slight fragments of a daily round, might everyone stay startlingly whole. When expeditions in later years came across what they had left, it felt as if time had worn thin. A ship lost amid warm water melts fast away into the sea. Up in the Arctic, it may merely bide its time. A hull can keep its quiet for a lifetime and longer. When at last it drifts into someone's view, it often seems to murmur in the accent of the age that first launched it toward the cold. The smallest absence could lift an ordinary vessel into legend. On a deserted deck, the sharpest clue was frequently not the thing left behind, but the thing gone. One empty davit where a boat had hung could rewrite an entire story. Such a gap whispered that the people aboard had not merely been washed away by some gray wave, nor struck down at their posts. They had chosen. They had swung a small craft over the side, or attempted it, and traded the timber and shelter beneath their feet for the bare swell of open water. That solitary fact could overturn everything a searcher believed. All at once, the empty ship looked like the lesser of two dreadful options. Why abandon her at all? A blaze, the dread of a blast below, the false glint of a coastline, a rising sea, broken gear, or simple terror after some sudden jolt could each have had its hand in it. And if the parent ship still rode the water after they were gone, the emptiness only grew sadder. Those who came after were left to read a survival gamble that may have drowned everyone who took it. Here lies one reason these tales never quite die. They are not riddles alone. They are the instance when a human verdict met the ocean under strain, and the ocean offered no account of how it ended. There was a time when the press could spin a forsaken ship into a wonder known across continents. In the years of canvas and coal smoke, a strange story from the water traveled at remarkable speed once an editor seized upon it. An abandoned vessel made flawless copy. It carried peril, far horizons, vanished souls, and just enough wreckage of fact to leave room for embellishment. The accounts ran through harbor towns, along telegraph wire, through illustrated weeklies, and afterward through the popular magazines. Each fresh telling thickened doubt into mood. Plain particulars were honed into omens. A logbook gone astray turned suspicious. A splintered hatch turned menacing. And in little time, an honest question of seamanship could be made to ring like evidence of something beyond nature. This carried weight because a great many readers would never glimpse the open sea, let alone stand on a deck amid Atlantic or Arctic mist. For them, the newspaper became the ocean itself. It painted the picture behind their eyes. That is how certain phantom vessels swelled past the modest events that bore them. They were never only puzzles of the sea. They were creatures of the press, molded by an era hungry for spectacle, for talk, for marvel, and for tales that declined to end tidily. A good many of these specters began as genuine catastrophes, only later dressed in myth, and that may be the most striking truth of the whole subject. Beneath many a celebrated phantom lies a real sequence of misfortune. Cruel weather, a course wrongly plotted, sickness in the crew, failing machinery, poor judgment, or nothing more exotic than ill luck. Yet across the years the mind sands down the jagged parts and pours something into the hollows. A hard case softens into a haunted one. Testimony at odds with itself hardens into a curse. A drifting wreck becomes a wraith. This working does not blot out the truth. It lays a second coat across it. What remains is a story with two separate lives. One belongs to the record, assembled from logs, wreck inquiries, survivor statements, and the dry letter of Admiralty rules. Fancy claims the second life, built up out of dread, repetition, and the magnetism of a question with no floor. Phantom ships dwell exactly where those two countries touch. Their lesson is that the past holds more than the bare thing that occurred. It is also what people credited, repeated, treasured, ornamented, and handed onward. The sea provided the riddle. People made certain it would never be allowed to fade. When the Mary Celeste was finally boarded, her freight sat entirely undisturbed. The sailors who climbed down into her hold in December of 1872 counted more than 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol still standing where they belonged. That registered at once. Had raiders carried off the ship, so valuable a load ought to have been stripped away. Had plunder driven the affair, the cabins and stores would surely have been ransacked. Instead, she held the unsettling air of a task broken off in the middle. The fortune lay below, while the very men who would have earned their wage by delivering it had vanished. That single circumstance turned the matter into a true enigma rather than a plain account of crime. Even so, the cargo itself may carry a fragment of the answer. The alcohol was a restless substance. Some barrels were afterward found drained or seeping, which opened the thought of vapor gathering in the dark below. It is worth noting that of the 1,701 casks, 9 were discovered empty, and a flash of fumes that left no scorch could have frightened a steady crew straight into the yawl. The untouched freight settled nothing. It only drove the mystery deeper. The vessel that came upon her was the Dei Gratia. No rescue steamer and no patrolling man of war, but another working merchantman under Captain David Morehouse. Early in December, midway across the Atlantic, Morehouse marked a brigantine ahead carrying herself oddly. She swung unsteadily and gave no proper answer to his signals. That was the first sign that matters aboard had gone gravely awry. When a boarding party pulled across and clambered up her side, they stepped into one of the most renowned scenes in the whole history of the sea. The sails were poorly trimmed. Water lay in her bilge, though never enough to take her under. The instruments for navigation were missing. No voice hailed them. No tread answered theirs. The men of the Dei Gratia then met a curious and practical trouble. They had found a ship worth a fortune, yet steering her safely to harbor meant courting tempest, the courtroom, and suspicion alike. A derelict was never a clean gift. The law of salvage promised a claim to whoever brought her in, but it could just as easily hang blame upon them. So they split their own company and worked both vessels toward port. The mystery was born in solitude, yet it lasted only because living onlookers boarded her before the ocean could rub every trace away. The vessel that history would eventually recognize as the Mary Celeste carried no such name when her story opened. Long before she turned into the most celebrated abandoned ship ever to wander an empty ocean, she went by another title and led an altogether separate existence. During 1861, on the shores of Nova Scotia, she was lowered into the sea under the christening of Amazon. Even those earliest days, according to the tellings, appeared darkened by some unkind shadow. The man who first commanded her sickened and perished only a short while after her opening voyage was underway. Across the seasons that came afterward, she ran into collisions, sustained damage, and changed hands repeatedly through a sequence of bad turns that started people muttering about a craft born beneath an unlucky star. Eventually, she was reconstructed and granted a different name. That renewed identity, Mary Celeste, was meant to hold the promise of a clean start. What it delivered instead was passage toward a stranger kind of lasting fame. Recalling that former name has value. since it makes plain to the listener that vessels possessed life stories rather than only journeys. They grew old, repaired, traded, and assigned to fresh purposes. This ship had already lived a restless span upon the waves well before the headlines told of her empty decks. By the moment she passed into legend, no blank page remained. Here was a laboring vessel marked with scars, a history, and a name already poised to grow dark. Some ships came not through fog but in clear daylight, and even then they declined to account for themselves. During January of 1921, just off the North Carolina coast, a towering 5-masted schooner bearing the name Carol A. Deering struck hard against Diamond Shoals, close by Cape Hatteras, ranking among the most feared lengths of the entire American seaboard. Nothing in the scene lay concealed. The schooner rose into view plainly, near enough to the land that people watching from shore could examine her through their spyglasses. And still, despite the wreck resting openly in front of them, the crew who ought to have filled her decks were simply absent. It was that contrast that rendered her impossible to forget. The majority of sea vanishings play out far beyond any onlooker and leave next to nothing for the curious to discover. This one drew up onto the shore as though upon a theater stage, along a coast long reputed as a graveyard, and even so, it would surrender no answer. The waters ran far too dangerous for any swift boarding, and so the schooner waited in plain sight while the rumors were granted room to spread. By the time the rescuers finally got to her, the puzzle had already grown. An enormous ship had not drifted off into tempest or haze. She had come, almost as if performing, to the country's outermost rim, vacant where she should have teemed with men who grasped how readily those seas could deal death. Once the investigators climbed at last onto the stranded schooner, the cookhouse offered a strangely recent tale. Food seemed to have been made ready, or at the very least placed out for the taking. The look of it was not the lengthy quiet of a ship deserted for weeks, but rather a busy crew whose everyday rhythm had broken off in the middle of motion. That sort of proof carries weight, for it tightens the reckoning of time. Whatever seized them might have struck fast, perhaps within the gap between one familiar chore and the following one. And yet, the belongings of the men and the ship's rescue equipment suggested otherwise. The crew had not simply drifted away from the planking. They had left, so it appeared, altogether, and in some rushed manner. That blend is what unsettles the mind. Here are traces of work, traces of leaving, and no plain span built across the two. The ocean teems with wrecks that account for themselves through obvious violence. This one gave order with no people, motion with no finish, which proves far more disturbing than any broken hull could ever be. There are vessels remembered for the debris they scatter and the bodies they surrender. And there are others remembered for nothing so tidy as wreckage. The HMO belonged to the second kind. Along the Alaskan and western Arctic coast, she did not become a single point on a chart, but a thread of reported glimpses, a thing passed mouth to mouth through fishing camps and trading posts. She slipped into the folklore of that shoreline precisely because she sat in the narrow gap between proven record and something almost too stubborn to credit. The people of the coast knew she had been real. They knew her crew had walked away from her. And they knew that season after season, other eyes had found her still drifting. Out of that shared knowing, the legend drew a strength most ghost tales never reach, for it rested on no lone, trembling witness, but on patient repetition, gathered across years and across scattered settlements. A fisherman might speak of her in passing. A hunter might watch the horizon for her. A bush pilot or a trader, sighting some dark shape ahead in the haze, might wonder quietly whether the old derelict had wandered back. So the land itself was folded into her account, a country of fog and grinding sea ice and weather that turned without warning, and of memory that did not let go. To the distant reader, she was a sensational marvel. To those who lived nearest her wandering path, she was something closer to a recurring season, a soft reminder that the cold ocean does not always conclude what it has set in motion. Far from that Pacific shore, another vessel offers a tale that sounds like a parable, yet rests on solid record. HMS Resolute was among the British ships dispatched into the Arctic during 1854 in the long hunt for Sir John Franklin. When merciless ice closed around the squadron, orders came down to give the ships up and march back across the frozen waste the crews had entered of their own will. That ought to have closed the matter. It did not. Months afterward, one of the surrendered ships worked herself loose and began a slow drift toward warmer latitudes. An American whaling vessel came upon her there, still afloat, weathered but sound. And here the story turns from the merely strange to the almost unbelievable, for she was not stripped for timber and forgotten. She was known, taken up with care, and at last carried home to Britain as a gesture of goodwill between nations. A ship left to die in polar ice had, in effect, opened a second life, passing from an imperial rescue mission into an emblem traded across an ocean. Most abandoned ships dwindle into solitary legend. This one stood instead as proof that the sea can hand back whatever people have already finished grieving. The recovery itself began with keen eyes and steady nerve in dangerous water. During September of 1855, the American whaler George Henry sighted a ship moving unguided through Davis Strait. She bore no crew and answered no hand at the wheel, yet she floated and could be saved. That alone would have been worth the telling, but the whaling captain grasped at once that this was no nameless hulk. She belonged to one of Britain's Arctic expeditions, and to bring her in would demand real seamanship, hard labor, and sound judgment in cruel seas. It would also raise the old question every derelict raised, for an abandoned hull was never a clean prize. Salvage law might let a finder claim her as reward, or it might leave him answerable for her, and the difference often turned on judgment made far from any court. A salvage party was set aboard and worked the empty ship southward through storm and doubt until she lay safe in harbor. There is a quiet satisfaction in that picture. A ship of exploration, lost to ice and to empire, was reclaimed not by a navy in glory, but by laboring whalers chasing a living in bitter waters. The episode shows, too, that a ghost ship was not always an ending in itself. Sometimes it became a feat of recovery, shaped by skill rather than by dread. Her story did not finish at the dock. Years on, when the ship was at last taken apart, some of her oak was worked into furniture, among it the famous Resolute desk. Queen Victoria presented that desk to America's president, and it endures as one of the most recognized objects in all of political life. The change is striking. Timber that had once groaned beneath Arctic pressure, drifted crewless through northern seas and outlasted its own salvage, now sits at the heart of modern statecraft. It is history pressed down into wood. Every stroke of a pen across that surface passes over material that knew a far harsher existence before it entered ceremony. Most lost ships leave only stories in some archive or a mark on a wreck chart. This one left a thing that can still be touched, a way for the long passage of polar venture and abandonment and rescue and reckless be felt in a warm room set far from any ice. Against such returns, the cold north kept its darkest silence for the ships of Franklin himself. When he sailed in 1845 to finish the Northwest Passage, Britain treated the venture as one more grand trial of its reach. Then both ships were simply gone. What came after was not a single failed search, but an obsession stretching across decades, sending one expedition after another into the ice. The sheer scale of that answer is part of what gives the story its weight. Naval officers, private patrons, American allies, and later lone seekers all bent themselves against the same silence. Maps were enlarged and fresh routes were tried, while hard proof arrived only in scraps, a campsite here, a note sealed in a tin, scattered relics, human remains, and the testimony of Inuit who had seen. The mounting effort grew into an age of exploration in its own right. The vanished ships were no longer merely missing. They had become the dark center of an undertaking charged with courage and suffering, with pride and with grief. The two ships at the heart of it carried names that seem almost too apt: HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Yet they were formidable craft, strengthened for polar work and stocked for years at sea. Their aim ranked among the great prizes of the century, a passable route through the Arctic to bind the Atlantic to the Pacific, a thing that promised glory and trade and the prestige of a nation. Instead, they entered the high north and passed out of European sight for good. That failure cut deep because these were no fragile improvisations. They embodied the confidence of a worldwide empire, the faith that discipline and machinery and careful planning could master a frozen land. The Arctic replied with nothing at all. What made the Franklin mystery uniquely haunting was less the disaster than the length of the not knowing that trailed it. For years, and then for decades, families and officials and the watching public held almost nothing certain. No survivor came back to speak. No harbor logged a final arrival. There was no clear wreck to point to. There was only silence, broken by fragments. A message left in a tin disclosed that Franklin had died and the ships had been given up. Inuit witnesses spoke of starving white men, of boats hauled across the ice, of desperate scenes. Relics rose to light in scattered places, never enough to close the account. Some accounts suggest the men were ground down by stages rather than struck by one blow. First the ice that turned the ships into prisons, then scurvy creeping in as stored food failed the body, and on top of it, a heavy burden of lead, likely from tinned provisions and perhaps from the ship's own water. Lead kills without spectacle, clouding judgment and fraying the nerves while the body wears away from within. A quiet ruin that matters terribly where clear thought decides between shelter and death. The Arctic still tells, in its way, of older drifting horrors, of the Octavius of legend, the ship said to be found gliding through the Northwest Passage with her whole crew frozen at their posts. The men of Franklin were not undone by one catastrophe. They were worn through by cold and hunger and sickness and poison together, and the Inuit who watched preserved clues that Victorian searchers too often set aside. For a great many years, some of the clearest light ever thrown on the fate of Franklin's lost expedition arrived not from the British searchers in any way, but from the Inuit whose lives unfolded inside that frozen country. They had looked upon the deserted camps. Starving men struggling over the ice were people they had met face to face. The very objects those vanished sailors left behind had passed through their own hands. What they remembered spoke of vessels gripped fast by the pack, of crews hauling boats across land through a region no outsider ever truly grasped, and of a slow, despairing march through a landscape the Empire could barely picture. And still, a great number of the Victorian searchers received these accounts with doubt, or brushed them away altogether, since the testimony failed to fit their settled notions about whose word deserved trust. That refusal would prove a costly thing indeed. The Inuit grasped that country in a manner both practical and deeply lived. The sea ice, the old paths of travel, the wandering of animals, the slender edges of survival, all of it they could read with a fluency no visitor might hope to equal. Distant rumor was not what they reached toward. They were telling of things that had happened inside the bounds of their own home. What seems so striking from where we stand now is how repeatedly the finds of later years bore out the core of what they had told. All along the Arctic had been speaking, by way of the very people who understood it best, and far too long the Empire chose silence in place of those voices. In due course, the wrecks of Erebus and Terror came once more into the light beneath Canadian waters. For more than 150 years, the lost ships of Franklin's company had drifted somewhere between record and myth, famous enough to disturb the imagination, yet nowhere a hand could reach. Then, finally, the North returned them. In 2014, Erebus came to light, and Terror was traced 2 years later in 2016, both lying in waters long entwined with Inuit knowledge. Extraordinary the discovery surely was, not merely for answering an old riddle of geography, but for turning a legend back into something firm and actual. After whole generations of charts marked with nothing but doubt, the ships at last held real graves upon the seabed. Their finding felt nearly like a faint cry cast out in 1845, finally receiving its reply. The whole scale of feeling around the story was changed by it. No longer were these only names lifted from grieving reports. They were genuine vessels, with cabins and decks and fittings, and the trace of human choices still resting quietly within their hulls. So completely, and for so long, had the sea hidden them, that bringing them back felt less like archaeology's patient labor and more like the prizing open of a sealed century. What survived of Terror, above all, proved astonishingly whole below the surface. When divers reached the wreck, what moved so many was not merely the fact of its discovery, but how entire it appeared, settled upright amid the cold and the dark. Strangely composed the ship looked, as if some hand had laid it down with care rather than wrenched it apart through any violence. As it should, the hull stood firm. In the windows the glass had stayed. Stretches of the upper structure had lasted. An unsettling force rode in that preservation, for it rendered the vessel less like wreckage and more like a waiting interior, a sealed and enclosed world whose people had only stepped out the previous day. Decay's long labor is slowed by cold water, and the Arctic had stood almost as a keeper over the wreck. Such soundness matters to history, holding as it does the promise of details no written page ever set down. Yet it matters to the heart no less. To watch a lost ship endure so long in the lightless deep is to feel the past draw all at once close. The vessel does not seem finished. Paused is how it seems, and that, somehow, is the thing that haunts more. From these solid hulls, the tale slips toward one of the strangest legends the North holds, the account of the Octavius and her frozen captain. Few stories of ghost ships are recounted with sharper chill. So the legend runs. A whaling vessel found her adrift across Arctic waters in the closing decades of the 18th century, and when the boarding party descended below, the entire crew lay dead of the cold. Most dreadful of all stood the captain, said to be sitting yet at his desk with his pen gripped in hand, as though the freeze had seized him in the very act of setting down the final hours of the voyage. It is no mystery why such a tale carried so far. To be forgotten is something the image refuses. Into one frozen scene it folds isolation, ambition, and sudden stillness. A man writes. Winter enters. Time halts. Onward the ship drifts. Whether real or not, the story lends shape to a dread sailors bore in their bones, the awareness that the ocean, and the polar ocean most of all, could lock a last moment so flawlessly that those who had died seemed merely paused, not departed. There the finish arrived with no roar whatever, but inside silence. No one has ever demonstrated that the tale of the Octavius truly came to pass. Some hold that the legend rose mostly from details too perfectly chilling to shrug off, since unlike the wrecks better fixed in record, she leaves behind no solid track of logs, port papers, or contemporary account firm enough to fasten her in fact. Look closely, and she appears as folklore stitched from the most potent shards of seafaring fear. Those frozen bodies. That captain still bent over his work. That impossible drift through the northern passage. The uncertainty takes nothing from her power. If anything, it deepens that power, for the story lays bare precisely what listeners yearned to credit. An image with a grip can travel farther than any proven event. Want of proof cannot end it, because it answers a thing more ancient than mere curiosity. To fear, it gives a shape. The truth may sway, but the feeling it bears holds steady. From the frozen north, the chronicle wheels south, toward a phantom that began not as a vessel at all, but as a caution passed from one mouth to the next. Before it set into the picture of a single cursed ship, the Flying Dutchman was nearer to a message borne along the spoken lore of mariners. The name stood for an impossible sight, together with the danger wrapped inside it. Somewhere beyond the next gray curtain of rain or mist, a ship might loom that no prudent seaman cared to encounter. In that earliest form, the story worked less as biography than as portent. It taught that the sea could trick the eye and could chasten pride. A captain who strove to force a stormy headland against fate, against God, against nature itself, might be doomed to sail without ever stopping. That moral frame carries weight. The tale did not spring up as empty fright. Out of a working world it came, one where weather, pride, and discipline traced the boundary between living and going under. The phantom was thus not merely a thing seamen dreaded glimpsing. It was a thing they dreaded becoming, a ship locked out for all time from safe harbor and from any human mercy. Its appearances were so frequently tied to storms, and that bond rings perfectly true to a sailor's mind. Storms narrow what the eye can take in, twist the reckoning of distance, and turn any gleam or shape into something jittery and unsure. A vessel caught sight of through sheets of rain or abrupt forks of lightning can seem to arrive and vanish against all sense. Add weariness and dread and the bare knowledge that foul weather slays, and the mind turns ready to read meaning into any strange form along the skyline. Here lies one reason the Dutchman bound itself so fast to the tempest. Calm seas and clear midday light were never its home. To the hours when nature already felt close to fury, it belonged. Accounts set the apparition by perilous headlands and waters battered by storm, and most of all, by the Cape of Good Hope, a backdrop that gave the legend its heft. The sea itself appeared to mount the vision, ringing cloud and spray and terror into a warning none would ever forget. Even a royal once told of having seen her. Part of why the legend held so fast is that it never stayed shut within old yarns spun in the forecastle. Late in the 19th century, the man who would become King George V, then serving as a young officer at sea, recorded that he and others aboard had seen a strange, glowing vessel, named among the crew as the Flying Dutchman, while voyaging off the coast of Australia. Whether a trick of the eye, a working of the air, or a thing dressed up afterward matters little to the legend's endurance. What matters is that trained eyes, men drawn from the loftiest ranks, were willing to set the experience down in earnest, and that handed the old story a fresh weight of authority. The tale took on a darker aftertaste yet, for one sailor reputed to have seen the apparition fell to his death that very day, which only firmed up the long belief that such sights foretold a death drawing near. So it was that a future king's notice did not gentle the legend, it swelled it. Phantom ship legends sank their deepest roots wherever the oceans ran perilous and unmapped. Across the chart, such stories never lay spread out evenly. Such legends gather, it seems, in the very regions where seafarers of old once met fog and reef, foul weather, and unruly currents, and that long, friendless gap of water lying between a hull and any port that might offer rescue. Across seas like those, doubt itself took on a kind of heft, almost a presence riding the swell. A shoreline could pull vessels under with no living witness to mark their loss. A curtain of haze could keep its rocks concealed until the planking groaned hard against them. A gale could carry off every hand and leave behind nothing but a scrap of half-remembered talk. That is the country where stories of phantom ships put down roots. They settle most readily wherever men had genuine cause to dread whatever the eye could not fully reach. And in this way, the same underlying notion keeps surfacing among maritime peoples who never once shared a coastline. Names shift, seas shift, yet the shape of the thing stays fixed. A vessel reveals itself where none ought to be. It carries some warning, some doom, some riddle. These were charts of dread as much as anything, marking out where fear once dwelt within the seafaring mind, and reminding those who listened later that dark water has long ranked among the great stages upon which people tell their tales. Mariners read these spectral hulls as tokens of a death or a ruin still to come. For all who labored upon the sea before forecasts and before the telegraph, the ocean often felt thick with meaning, a place where small signs seemed to speak. A wind that veered without warning, a strange tint washing along the sky, a flock of birds wheeling in some unaccustomed way, each could appear to carry weight. Held in that frame of mind, an emptied or ghostly hull was not merely odd. It could feel like a prophecy. Should a ship turn up where it had no business being, or be found deserted in some uncanny fashion, many took it as a sign foretelling something still drawing near. Perhaps a storm, perhaps a wreck, perhaps a death upon their very own decks. And coincidence, which the sea pours forth without any measure, only hardened that faith. A curious sighting ahead of foul weather would lodge in memory forever. A strange meeting before a shipmate died became, once retold, a kind of proof. Given time, such patterns set like resin into certainty. That is what handed these tales their grip. They were never mere diversions. They had been stitched into the sea's own climate of feeling, where dread so often came ashore ahead of any explanation that could account for it. Some of the oddest forces behind these stories amounted to nothing more than tricks played by the air. There is a mirage named Fata Morgana, and it arises when bands of cold and warmer air bend the light in unaccustomed ways, above all, over water. A ship lying past the curve of the world can be drawn out, raised, twisted, or piled into impossible shapes that appear to float over the waves. Masts climb into towers, hulls draw out long or seem to hang in air. The whole apparition can look less like an honest vessel than a castle adrift, or some craft belonging to a world other than ours. To seamen who knew nothing of the optics, the spectacle proved deeply convincing. Even today, a photograph of such a mirage carries an unsettling charge. What grants the thing its fascination is that the sky conjures nothing at all. It merely reshapes what already stands there, just enough to render the real impossible. Along that narrow seam dividing the true from the illusory, no small number of sea legends came into being. A genuine ship rests somewhere beyond view, yet what arrives at the eye is strange enough to be taken for a ghost. The moon and the fog wrought transformations of their own. Light upon the sea rarely behaves the way it behaves on land. The moon can press distance flat, lay silver across the water, and peel away the very details that name a thing. Then, fog comes rolling in like a wall on the move, laying one fragment bare while it swallows the rest. A plain vessel, in such conditions, can grow nearly past bearing to look upon. A few pale sails catch the glow. The hull has vanished. A lantern glows where no deck seems to stand. The ship slips by in silence, for wind and distance have carried off its voice. The mind sets to finishing the picture, and what it finishes can prove far stranger than the truth. Darkness does not merely cover over, it revises. It surrenders the sea in pieces, and dares the imagination to bind them whole. Seamen knew this through long acquaintance, and the knowing did nothing whatever to still their fear. If anything, it honed that fear, for they grasped how little the night was ever willing to promise. Disease worked a grimmer variation again, since it could hollow out a hull from within before any land ever climbed above the horizon. Should a fever or cholera take its hold, a ship might turn first into a floating sick room and afterward into a floating tomb. The living among them could die, or take flight, or be borne off under emergency, while the hull went drifting onward, still afloat, yet stripped of all ordinary life. Vessels of that kind were frequently held at a distance from harbor, treated as perilous objects before anyone ashore could even say what had truly come to pass aboard. The annals of quarantine teem with scenes in which dread outpaced what was known, and rumor bred as swiftly as any contagion. The sea, so it is told, has kept on yielding such drifting hulls down into modern times. The Lyubov Orlova, a derelict cruise liner, slipped her tow and roamed the North Atlantic through 2013, the subject of uneasy reports claiming she bore nothing aboard but rats. A nearer look reveals just how little the old dread has genuinely faded. A shell finds its mark, and within heartbeats the corridors below fill with flame. Smoke pools in the sealed compartments where a moment before men had stood at their stations. The order comes to go over the side while the deck is still level, or there is no order at all. Only sailors leaping into the cold spray because to remain is to burn. In that instant, a vessel ceases to be a thing of command and becomes merely an object, surrendered to the swell, to the wind, and to the fire that gnaws through her plating. Across the long wars of the Steel Age, this happened more times than any ledger could hold. Merchant hulls drifted on after a torpedo struck them in the night. Warships glowed against the dark with no living soul aboard. Some slipped under in their own good time, quietly. Others went on moving, scorched and hollow, accidental wanderers carried forth from the machinery of modern battle. There is a particular chill to these cases, for they wore the shape of immense power. Engines, wireless sets, gun turrets, all of it reduced in a moment to an empty shell sliding across open water. The fighting tore the crews away in a single breath and left the sea to complete what the guns had begun. A great engagement did not always close where it opened. A damaged ship might outlast the blow that struck her, holding afloat long enough to drift unmanned for hours or even days. Her people might be slain at their posts, taken off in haste, or moved across to another deck under fire, and still the wounded hull would not go down. Then the currents claimed her. She would wander on, bearing her shattered guns and her blackened decks through a stillness that felt almost reverent after the roar that had filled her. The image lingers precisely because a sea battle is remembered as thunder and impact, and yet some of its strangest endings were hushed. A vessel, lately loud with shouted orders and clanging alarms, might be cited later as a silent thing, moving without will across waters that had altered around it. Such drifting remnants were no harmless curiosities. They could deceive a lookout's eye, foul a shipping lane, or be fired upon a second time. The chronicles dwell on the explosions, yet the quiet aftermath asks for its own remembrance. That moment when iron continues onward, and the living heart of the ship is already gone. Fire alone, without any enemy, could empty a deck in the space of minutes. A blaze afloat has always ranked among the gravest of a mariner's terrors, for the sea grants almost no honest escape. Caught between the heat at his back and the water below, a sailor has nowhere clean to flee. Tarred rope, dry timber, oiled paint, packed cargo, and a freshening wind can carry a small flame into ruin with appalling speed. Once the smoke crowds into narrow passages, a man loses his bearings. The shouted commands grow faint, and fear begins to climb. Boats are swung out, or bodies go over the rail, long before the ship herself has any intention of sinking. That is how a burning hull turns into a ghost ship within mere moments. The human presence gets driven off in a sudden scramble, yet the structure lingers, glowing and smoldering, carried on across the dark. Witnesses never forgot such sights, because they overturned the ordinary order of peril. The vessel stood plainly there, often blazing and vivid against the night, and still the life that had moved within her had been cast out in minutes. Fire did more than wound a ship. It could strip her of her people in an instant. Not every empty deck began in misfortune. Some began in cold arithmetic. A failing vessel, an owner with debts pressing close, and a generous policy of insurance together brewed a temptation as old as trade itself. If a ship were to vanish at the convenient hour, or be discovered adrift under murky circumstances, the underwriter's payment might stand in for the honest profit no longer to be wrung from a voyage that had soured. That shadow troubled maritime investigators, for the ocean unmakes evidence with a terrible grace. Logbooks go missing. Fire smears the line between cause and consequence. A crew might plead panic or sudden danger, then scatter into distant ports beneath new names. Owners stood accused, in certain affairs, of over-insuring tired hulls and arranging their quiet loss. The outcome was a curious marriage of legend with crime. An abandoned ship might wear the face of a supernatural riddle, when she was in truth a line in a fraudulent account. It is a thought that deepens the fascination of some of these cases, for beneath the deserted planking there may lie not a haunting at all, but a scheme. Salvage law sharpened the temptation in its own way, since a derelict was never a simple gift. A finder might claim her for reward, or find himself blamed for her fate. A ship at sea leaned upon hierarchy more wholly than almost any place ashore. Orders had to be obeyed without question, and discipline had to hold through every watch. Let that frame collapse, and the vessel could change her nature in a single night. Mutiny rarely arrived with the flourish of the storyteller's imagination. It might begin small, in resentment over spoiled food, withheld wages, harsh punishment, or a master whose judgment the men no longer trusted. Then came the reckoning. Officers were overpowered, struck down, or cast off in a boat. The ship herself might be seized and turned, or stripped of the very hands who alone knew how to keep her safe. So a working vessel could be left eerily empty, her mutineers fleeing in the boats, deserting her after some damage, or melting away into a foreign harbor while the hull they had abandoned wandered on. What grips the listener is the closeness of it. Reefs and gales are impersonal forces. Mutiny is human ruin in cramped quarters, where fear and fury and the hunger for power reduce a ship to a drifting aftermath. Piracy, too, hollowed out crews and left the ships to roam. The robbers of the sea seldom sank everything they overtook. Often they wanted only the cargo, the stores, the charts, or whatever could be carried off. And once that was done, the hull itself was so much refuse. A plundered ship might be emptied of her people as surely as of her goods, left with no hand to steer her, mend her, or speak to what had occurred. In crowded waters, such a derelict became a sight that deeply unsettled the eye. Seen from afar, she still seemed a ship making way. Drawn near, she was only the husk of one. Piracy bred rumor, for witnesses were few and survivors never assured. An empty vessel found in the wake of a raid told almost nothing plainly. Had her crew been murdered, carried into captivity, pressed into the pirates' own service, or set adrift in boats to perish? The doubt is what gave such cases their grim, dark edge. Piracy needed nothing of the supernatural to fashion a ghost ship. It simply erased the tale of the people and abandoned the object where it lay, still afloat, yet emptied of all command and name. It is believed that more than one quiet derelict, sighted far from any port, owed its silence to such a raid rather than to any phantom. A rudder broken by heavy weather could leave a ship turning as though bewitched. A vessel robbed of her steering is never truly free. She may keep her sails, her buoyancy, her motion, and still lose all sense of direction. In a rising sea, that loss makes for an uncanny spectacle. Rather than gaining ground, she yaws, slips sideways, and circles again and again beneath the shove of wind and wave. To a watcher, above all in fog, it can seem the ship is snared within her own pattern, unable to break loose from a single patch of gray water. That is one reason crippled vessels so often drew ghostly descriptions, for they appeared alive and yet emptied of all purpose. Before the coming of modern distress signals, a rudder failing far from any aid could prove fatal, even while the hull stayed sound. The crew might labor at repairs, lower the boats, or be torn loose amid the struggle, abandoning the maimed ship to go on with that haunting rotation of hers alone. There is something one cannot forget in that vision. A vessel still bound to the will of nature, but no longer bound to the will of any soul aboard. A fallen mast could doom a ship's company without ever sinking the ship. Disaster at sea is imagined as total wreckage, yet sometimes the killing blow was narrower and crueler than that. A mast brought down could turn a sound vessel into a drifting plight almost at once. In the age of canvas, masts served as no ornament. They meant movement, control, and hope itself. When one came down in a gale, it could rip the rigging apart, crush the boats, maim the crew, and drag perilously against the side. To cut it loose called for strength and steady nerve. Even should the ship live through that first chaos, she might then lie helpless, unable to make headway or to reach any haven before water, food, and resolve ran thin. Rescue could lie far beyond reach. The sea around her could stay rough for days. In just that way, a vessel could turn into a ghost ship and yet never properly go to wreck. The hull still floated. Her people had merely been robbed of any means to command what came next. Few things lay bare the fragility of the old seafaring more plainly than one mast that fell at the worst possible hour. And some abandoned ships, strangest of all, were boarded to find animals still living amid the silence. Nothing sharpens the eeriness of a deserted deck like creatures still moving through it. In more than one famous account, rescuers climbed aboard braced for emptiness and came instead upon cats, dogs, chickens, or canaries left behind. The detail strikes hard because the animals explain nothing. They only deepen the human absence. The catamaran Kaz II, found off the Australian coast in 2007, with her engine running and a meal laid out, had given up her 3 men to the sea, and such still-set tables have long unsettled those who came after. A dog waiting upon an empty deck speaks of a loyalty for which no rescue ever came. A bird still drawing breath inside its cage tells, in its hushed way, of hours slipping by within a world its people have already departed. Such modest survivors carry a plain word to those who afterward come to study what was left. The leaving, they seem to murmur, arrived in haste. There was, it may be, no instant and no space to bring every living thing down into the boats before the deck was surrendered. And yet, the feeling such creatures stir runs far past anything a man with a notebook could set down. Their being there makes the planking and the cordage seem only freshly dwelt upon and cruelly broken off. The patient turns of feeding and of fellowship, the everyday motions of a day upon the sea, linger faintly in the air. Where the souls have drifted off and the beasts remain behind, the stillness gathers a weight past mere puzzle. It turns tender, and it aches. The wandering yacht grew into the phantom of the wireless age. That old dread did not melt away once the world turned modern. It merely dressed itself anew. Where once there rose tall square riggers and icebound explorers, the 1900s handed the ocean its forsaken pleasure craft and small-powered hulls, each fitted with a radio, a motor, and gauges their grandfathers had never imagined. In some fashion that rendered the riddle stranger yet. With a wireless lying near to hand, how could the absence of any cry for help explain the trouble? With charts spread, with engines spinning, with forecasts grown keener, How could a hull still roam the water with no living grip upon her? The fresher derelicts disturb the heart in a key apart from the ancient ones, since they rest closer to the present day. Their cabins resemble rooms a listener might recognize. Their fittings appear shaped to hold a sailor from harm. And then they turn up empty, and every solace drops away within one breath. The screens go on glowing. The life jackets may still swing upon their hooks. A dish of supper may linger on a ledge no one comes back to. The span between what such a craft could manage and what befell her is the entire mystery. These hulls hold one firm lesson. Skill can dull the peril, yet it can never rob the sea of its ancient knack for hush, for confounding, for taking people down entire. The Kaz, too, turned up roaming with not a hand upon her wheel. In the year 2007, a catamaran of that very name was come upon in seas off Australia, in a condition that looked nearly staged to vex the mind. Her motor still pressed her ahead. A setting had been laid out at the table. A laptop rested open and lit. The radio replied when someone tried it. None of the life jackets had gone missing, and the trio of men who had put to sea aboard her were plainly absent. Nothing told of a struggle or bloodshed, and the cabin held out no neat reply to whoever searched within it. It is the sheer ordinariness of the scene that grips the memory. Here was no boat trailing in the wake of ruin. Here was a boat checked in the midst of its living. That difference bears true weight, since the joins of it hint at a strand cut clean rather than a thing wrecked. The men who studied the affair weighed ideas like one fellow tumbling into the sea and the rest going in to fetch him, in a rescue that came to nothing. Yet firm knowledge never landed. In an age of motors and signaling sets and vigilant shores, the vacant catamaran felt oddly of some other century. She was a craft of the present that had slid backward into the most ancient grammar of the ghost ship tale. The Joyita lay half sunk and obstinately would not founder. When that trading vessel was discovered across the South Pacific in 1955, she seemed hung between ruin and survival. She rode low and grievously flooded, canting hard onto one side, and floated still. That owed nothing to luck. A cork lining and a buoyancy built into her had rendered her remarkably hard to put beneath. The look of her must have been a thing not quickly forgotten, a hull that appeared all but conquered and yet refused to go down. Her dogged endurance only deepened the mystery, for the people who had sailed in her could nowhere be found. 25 passengers and crew had departed a ship that, mauled though she was, held fast and stubborn to the surface of the water. That contradiction rests at the core of her tale. A vessel that goes under accounts for itself plainly enough. A vessel that carries on without her people lays far harder questions before the listener. Why abandon her? What dread could have towered worse than remaining? And so the Joyita lodged in the memory, because she looked not like a wreck, but like a survivor, pressing onward without the souls who had laid their trust in her care. 25 lives slid away from the Joyita, and no plain answer was ever set down. It is the bare count of the missing that grants the case its dreadful pull. One lost sailor alone is a grief. 25 gone from a ship afterward found afloat becomes a thing far heavier and far darker. She had left Samoa bound for Tokelau, bearing cargo and passengers and crew, and then she failed ever to arrive. When at the last she was tracked down, there lay damage and flooding and gear that had disappeared, yet never quite enough to render the loss simple. Boats, papers, a portion of the emergency stores had gone. So had each person aboard. Some tellings remark that her life rafts, too, were missing, and that not one among the 25 was ever glimpsed again. Those who pored over the case put forward theories of an engine breaking down, of signals gone awry, of panic, of an abandonment performed upon mistaken fears, and not a single one of them ever wholly hushed the imagination. A party of that size speaks of choices weighed in common, of strain shared, of a fear coursing through many at one stroke. It means that many minds met the same trouble and still reached an end that stays shut to anyone gazing on from without. That is the reason the tale endures. It is not merely an account of vanishing. It is the account of a whole little human company quitting a vessel, and quitting it with no last certainty. The Joyita's clocks had fallen silent, and yet her radio sat tuned and waiting. Among the particulars that render her so haunting are the small mechanical marks of an effort cut off. The clocks aboard had halted, hinting that power or workings had failed by degrees through whatever ordeal played out. Yet the radio stood fixed to the band kept for distress, which implies that some hand had reached out for help, or at the very least, had steeled itself for the hour when reaching out would be wanted. These are no grand clues, and therein lies the very fount of their power. They ring true. They place living people back within the unfolding trouble, watching their gauges, aching for a reply, marking the hours as they begin to bleed away. The tuned radio bears a particular weight, for it speaks of intention. Some hand spun that dial as the danger swelled. Some heart trusted that rescue might yet respond. Lay that alongside the stilled clocks, and the whole vessel comes to seem a chamber where action faltered one stride short of saving itself, a call set ready for a listening world while the time drained off all the same. What troubled so many about the Jiangsheng was not the bareness of her decks by itself, but the absence in her records. A ship of such tonnage is supposed to drag a paper wake along behind it. Insurance, a flag, a registry, a sequence of names accountable for her movements and her cargo. When a hull of that scale eased into view dragging none of it, the feeling was of a small rip opening across the tidy fabric of the contemporary sea. The puzzle had two halves. Who had abandoned her? And how could so much steel hide itself this thoroughly while afloat where anyone might look? The authorities never resolved her true point of origin. That open gap is what bore her past the drab heading of salvage and toward something nearer to legend. Officials climbed aboard, hauled her in, and inventoried her fittings, yet her past stayed only partly recorded. A few proposed she had at some point worked for illegal fishing fleets out in remote waters. Others speculated about foreign owners and a hushed, intentional walk-away. Some pointed to the bare arithmetic, that a tanker grown old can become expensive enough to merely be released. Still, no neat record of her origins was ever set before the public. In an era crowded with satellites, harbor beacons, customs records, and registries, such a thing appears almost out of reach, and that very impossibility is the root of its hold. It suggests that even today, the oceans keep thin pockets where accountability dissolves, and a vessel may yet wander in carrying nothing more than a question mark. The disquiet runs less Gothic than those older tales, and no kinder for being so. She turned into an emblem of seafaring anonymity, hushed proof that the ocean can devour not merely people but paperwork, intent, and beginnings together. The Valencia produced a haunting of another sort, one of phantom lifeboats and survivors unwilling to stay gone. She broke apart on the rocks off Vancouver Island in 1906, forced against the stone in vile weather, and the loss earned its bleak reputation immediately. Because the rescue collapsed into chaos, the shore showed no mercy, and the count of the dead ran huge. In the years that came after, her account would not stay confined to the official pages. It grew into folklore. People told of lifeboats bound to the catastrophe rising long after the hull had vanished, and of wan figures and ghostly shapes seen along that shore. Such growth, it is held, sprang naturally from the place itself, a stretch already feared for its wrecks, hammering surf, and blinding fog. where calamity looked half done by its very character, and imagination softly finished what the water had started. The Valencia joined those losses that never fully ceased happening within the public mind, every new rumor hinting the drowned had not wholly departed the shore, and that the tide was still rehearsing their end. Some of why this tale would not perish lies in how the ocean kept returning its remnants. Far past the moment when the affair ought to have sunk into history, fragments of her went on washing up along the coast. Each rescued shard bore a weight reaching well beyond its size. A shattered boat, a float, a strip of wreckage. Each seemed to tear the wound back open. The sea, so it looked, had not yet stopped speaking. This counts because such legends flourish when time itself acts oddly. Where proof comes all at once, a tale comes to rest. Where it trickles in eerie installments stretched over years, the affair feels open, and open things turn haunted. And so it went here. The shore went on offering its reminders, and every one gave the rumor new fuel. To the communities close by, the disaster stayed bodily near, not something spoken in past tense, but something the coastline seemed loath to let go. The bleakest image of them all fastened onto the Valencia over time. The telling holds that a lifeboat tied to the wreck turned up years later, with skeletons still sitting inside it. True or not, the story carried because it gathered the entire dread of waiting at sea into one image. A craft made for rescue became a drifting coffin. The dead kept in their seats, arranged as though still expecting aid that never reached them. It is almost too sharp to fade from memory. Certain accounts hold that such tales collect wherever grief, delay, and shattered scraps of evidence converge, and the Valencia furnished every one. The legend may stand on no solid proof, yet it shows how people came to terms with so immense a loss. They imagined the dead not simply gone, but held in suspension, kept by the water, and rescue gear became a final and terrible tableau. The Orang Medan persists as among the oddest legends ever born by radio. By the account, distress calls came to other ships from somewhere within Southeast Asian waters, the wording portraying death aboard in flat and ghastly terms. When aid came, the crew were said to be found lifeless, their faces fixed in looks of terror. And before the puzzle could be properly studied, the vessel burst into flame and exploded, going under with whatever answers she carried. It is a story almost flawlessly cut for its era. The wireless delivers the alarm. Contemporary rescue shows up a shade too late. The proof surfaces and then wipes itself out. A nearer view shows the documentation to be flimsy indeed, and historians have long questioned whether the matter can be followed through any dependable shipping record or period report. The holes run broad enough that many now hold the account was greatly embroidered or fabricated wholesale. Still, it endures because it brushes a fear the earlier legends could not approach. The terror of a voice stretching out through machinery at the very brink of death, and then going quiet forever. Even supposing the famous message was never transmitted, it seizes the emotional logic of horror in the radio age. A signal comes in off open water. It appears to pledge an explanation. Instead, it leaves nothing but atmosphere, rumor, and a hush more enduring than any proof. An invented ghost ship is never genuinely about nothing. Even a tale that resists confirmation still holds the form of a real fear. Sailors assembled their stories out of whatever bore down hardest on the mind in open water. The squall that hit with no warning, the ship that dropped beneath the horizon and never came back, the captain who pushed his crew past reason, the prospect of perishing wholly unseen. That is the reason these invented stories matter. They read as emotional charts of life upon the sea. One legend lingers on endless wandering because being lost was a terror, much as a windless gyre such as the Sargasso Sea, that vast, drifting expanse of floating weed, could keep a becalmed ship still for weeks together. Another fixes on a dead crew because illness and isolation were never distant. A third hinges on a cursed captain because command aboard bore such tremendous weight. In every one, the invented detail leads back to something genuine. The story may be false, but the fear inside it is usually true, and that is the source of such folklore's value. For it lays bare what sailors feared when the sea ran dark and tomorrow looked uncertain. The seabird keeps the same company. Among the strangest legends of New England is the tale of a vessel said to have run softly ashore in Rhode Island during the 18th century with not a soul on her. Everything, by the telling, spoke of human presence departed only moments before. Breakfast still lay ready. Ordinary life looked paused rather than over, for the ship had not arrived as wreckage, but as an open question. That picture is exactly why it endured. A vessel running aground is ordinary enough. A vessel doing so amid such hushed domestic interruption stays unforgettable. It turns the shoreline into a stage and makes the ship a single frozen scene. Those who study these matters hold the tale gently, since its particulars drifted from one telling to another, and still it lingered. For inside it lives the truest outline of a phantom craft. The ocean will not always give back what it has shattered and splintered. Now and then, at least where legend rules, it yields up something almost entire, as if the souls aboard had merely strayed off for a single breath and then somehow failed to return. Up along the northeastern shores of America, settlements gathered accounts of vessels arriving with no living person aboard. Those New England coasts proved rich soil for such lore, since there the crowded lanes of trade ran up against perilous skies, sharp, rocky landings, and a folk whose recollection was already cured in the salt of many generations. To such people, a ship meant nothing distant or abstract. It stood for toil and lineage, for fortune and leaving and danger, all knotted into one. And thus, the moment a hull came drifting in wounded, hollowed out, or shrouded in circumstances beyond anyone's grasp, the shore was poised to gather it tenderly into tail. The harbor towns, the fishing villages, the island settlements, and the solitary stations of the lighthouse keepers all turned into cradles where stories of this kind could settle and bloom by degrees. A solitary schooner sighted past the surf might be talked of through 30 winters. A wreck of murky beginnings could stiffen into local legend before the season itself had turned over. What grants this band of shoreline its heft is that the tales of crews who had vanished did not lie only upon printed leaves. They traveled by speech, by what each generation bequeathed to the one after, by the very shape of the ground itself. A neighbor might raise a hand toward the precise swell of water where the uncanny thing had lifted into sight. That pinned the stories down to a particular place, so they seemed less like things invented and more like one further current threading through how the coast itself remembered. The whaling grounds bred their own disquieting reports of ships abandoned to wander with no hand upon them. Whaling bore men off into vast, icy, and often barren waters, where any rescue might be reckoned in weeks or whole months of distance. That fact by itself made the trade fertile soil for accounts of derelict craft. A whaler, far removed from the customary shipping routes, might happen upon some other vessel, battered, deserted, or simply sliding along in a fashion that looked wrong to the eye. Since those grounds extended into the loneliest stretches of both the Atlantic and the Pacific, any odd apparition gathered fresh power from its own isolation. Witnesses were few, tidings traveled at a crawl rather than a run, and there was generous space for dread to rise. The drawn-out absences and the punishing labor of the work honed both emotion and superstition together. Men who had spent entire months surrounded by ice, haze, and perilous chase needed scarcely any prompting to read an odd ship as a warning. A great many of the longest-lasting accounts of crewless craft survived for the simple reason that whalers were present out there, on hand to see what no one else would ever set eyes upon. They worked as hunters and, without meaning to, as keepers of the record, carrying home stories from stretches of sea where the ordinary explanations always felt too flimsy to bear the weight. The clutch of the pack ice could hold a vessel so perfectly that it seemed only to be at rest. A peculiar dread clings to any ship frozen and unmoving. Neither broken nor drowned nor visibly ruined, merely held in place. The pack ice accomplishes precisely this. It gathers itself around a hull so thoroughly that the craft looks not so much wrecked as paused, as though some hand had set a finger upon the turning wheel of time and quieted it. That frozen hush is what gives the polar phantom ship tales their odd potency. A vessel caught within the ice may hold on to its masts, its little boats, its rigging, even faint marks of the days once spent aboard, while every trace of motion ebbs out of the scene. The sea itself has turned into a flat and level plain. The ship has turned into a motionless structure standing inside silence. To anyone who gazed upon it, this could feel far more disturbing than plain destruction, because the vessel still bore the look of a thing able to live. It simply could press on no further. That distinction carries its own weight within the chest. A shattered wreck declares that the ending has already come and gone. A vessel locked in ice murmurs instead that the end has not quite arrived, only halted upon its very doorstep. Among the frozen latitudes, such doubt could reach across whole seasons or across many years, which let the ship appear not truly dead, but hung somewhere between the world of the living and whatever follows it. It stands among the oldest of these legends that a craft named the Octavius was said to drift through the ice-bound channels of the far north with every man aboard frozen at his station, the captain still bowed above his log. Whether anything of that kind ever truly came to pass is doubtful, and yet the picture stayed. For cold works upon a deserted vessel what warm water never manages. Once a ship is lost in temperate seas, decay falls to its labor quickly and shows no mercy. Up in the polar regions, the cold drags out that ruin so deeply that ordinary objects last with surprising obstinacy. This explains why forsaken craft of the Arctic and the Antarctic so frequently feel like vessels of time held in store. A pair of boots may yet sit beside a bunk. A stove may rest where it had always stood. Tools may linger in the very place a hand last let them go. The impression made is tender, not grand. It is not the ship by itself that endures, but the small cadence of living once carried out within it. They preserve far more than the recollection of exploration. They preserve the morning meal, the dull hours, the labor, the routine. One starts to sense the people who once moved through those cramped quarters without ever once catching sight of them. So the cold draws the gap tighter between the imagining of a later age and the lives that quietly slipped off, until in place of remote and faceless loss, one comes upon a whole small world suspended in frozen stillness. Some of these hulls yielded up footwear and volumes, implements and tinned food still sealed and never broken open. The things abandoned can disturb more deeply than the vessel that once held them. A boot summons the foot that once filled it. A book summons a still evening at sea, a few quiet moments before the coming of sleep. A tool tells of work cut short. A sealed tin tells of a tomorrow that was being arranged for and never came. Such particulars matter because they pare the disaster down to the scale of one single life. Instead of conjuring a faceless crew in the abstract, one pictures the hands turning over the leaves, the chilled fingers shutting upon metal, the figure laying that tin aside for a dawn that never broke. They belong not to the dramatic final scene, but to the everyday life that was supposed to continue on. When the sea preserves them, it preserves intention in itself. The ship may go on living as legend, yet the small objects whisper of true people whose plans were severed in the very middle of a sentence. The forsaken ships of exploration held within them the loneliness of entire empires. Craft of that sort were never simply a means of carrying things. They bore the ambition of nations, the hopes of science, the dreams of trade, and the pride of states keen to press their stamp upon the empty stretches of the chart. This is the reason their abandonment feels so enormous. When one of them was given over to the ice or found standing empty, the loneliness was no private matter. It seemed to belong to a whole empire suddenly coming up against its own boundary. The empty deck of a ship of exploration can therefore feel wholly unlike the bare deck of a vessel of trade. It lies heavy with purpose. The charts, the instruments, the laid-in provisions, the cabins fashioned with such care, all tell of planning conceived upon a sweeping scale. Yet the moment the people are gone, those very emblems become proof of failure and of grasping beyond one's reach. A solitary, deserted ship of expedition can seem to carry not only its missing sailors, but the silence of a nation that had counted on mastery and was given only doubt. The parties of search swelled, more often than not, into phantom ship tales all their own. Among the oddest patterns across the long chronicle of the sea is that ships sent forth to unwind a mystery would now and then slip quietly into one of their own. Expeditions of rescue sailed into rough waters already shadowed by peril, by unreliable charts, by weather that would not hold steady, by the heavy press of feeling. They were chasing after the lost, often carrying the hopes of nations or the grief of families left behind, and that rendered them fragile in more ways than just one. Should such a vessel be locked fast in ice, broken apart, or simply running late, the public mind could set to its work well before any facts had come ashore. There were occasions when the very ships sent out to find Franklin, or lost whalers, or vanished traders were themselves left as derelicts, or afterward met under uncanny conditions. The pattern doubles back upon itself. A ghost ship summons a search. The search, in turn, brings forth yet another ghost ship tale. This lays bare something profound about the ocean. It shows no deference to our craving for a close. There are times when the work of answering one riddle of the sea only stretches it wider. The rescuer is pulled into the same haunted design, one further name written down inside a slowly widening ring of the unknown. The sea keeps names alive long after the logbooks have moldered into nothing. A ship's documents may rot, burn, founder, or scatter upon the wind, and yet the name has a way of outliving them. It survives within the columns of aged newspapers, within the stories passed around inside families, within the records kept at the harbor, within ballads and charts and conversation handed down across the generations. That persistence matters, for a name carries identity in a manner that bare wreckage never can. A broken hull lying upon the seabed amounts to nothing but an object. The instant it is tied to a name, it turns into a remembered life. Here lies one reason the history of these vanished crews keeps such lasting force. Even where the documents are torn through and the physical traces are gone, the name remains ready for imagination, for grief, for the telling again. Mary Celeste, Bichoumont, Terra, Valencia. The names by themselves start to gather a weather all their own. They turn into a kind of shorthand for endings that were never brought to rest. And there was forever a further burden pressing on those who chanced upon such a hull, since a drifting derelict was never some plain gift lifted up by the waves. Under the old laws of salvage, the one who found her might press a claim to a reward, or might just as readily find suspicion gathering around him. To climb aboard an empty ship was to step into questions every bit as much as into wealth. In that sense, the sea does not carry its forgetting evenly. It lets certain things slide away and grips others tight, and the names it elects to keep drift on long after the people who once answered to them have passed beyond all finding. The sea may carry off the men, the logbooks, and the very planks, and still surrender the one thing by which a vessel can be called back into memory. its name endures. That single word keeps a hull moving through the years long after fog has swallowed all the rest. Editors of old newspapers cherished such tales, for a riddle outsold a fact, and a closed account ended a reader's interest where an open one renewed it each morning. A derelict reaching harbor with no plain cause behind its silence was, for them, almost a gift, drama enough to bind an audience night after night. It is believed this rarely sprang from outright deceit. More often it was a matter of weight, of which detail was allowed to rise. The strangest line floated to the surface. The dull reckoning of bilge water and wind sank quietly beneath the fold. Over the long span of years, that tilt shaped what people held in mind. They did not recall a depth of flooding or a heading. They recalled a meal abandoned mid-bite and a deck gone soundless. So certain ordinary misfortunes drifted from the realm of report into the slower country of legend. The press not inventing the wonder, only choosing which fragment of the truth would never be forgotten and which would fade in silence. When the telegraph wires were strung across the land, these alarms outran the storms that birthed them. In earlier days, such news had moved no faster than a hull or a sealed letter, passed mouth to mouth from one key to the next. After the wires came, word of a deserted ship could reach far inland by the hour. A vessel found empty in one port becoming the talk of a breakfast table hundreds of miles distant. The dread was no longer a thing held by one harbor. It became something shared at once, across great distance, reprinted in fragments before any patient hand could check it. A vivid first telling could outpace its own correction and lodge itself in the imagination before the calmer truth arrived. The ocean stayed as old and merciless as ever, yet now its eeriest stories ran along copper as well as water. A fresh kind of haunting carried on the hum of the line. There were illustrators, too, who turned a bare deck into a vision of nightmare. Long before any moving picture, the engraved plate taught ordinary people how a ghost ship ought to look. From a few cold lines of report, the artists conjured moonlit boards, sails torn to ribbons, a lifeboat swinging loose on its falls, a cabin lamp still burning as though its keeper had stepped out only a moment before. Such pictures did far more than ornament a column. They steered the heart. Because few readers would ever stand upon a truly forsaken vessel, the drawing often became, in the mind, the event itself. A practical case of salvage could be rendered as something near to the supernatural, and it was the image, not the date or the port, that outlived the facts. The Victorian age proved fertile ground for all of this, an era of widening papers, imperial commerce, and a deep hunger for the uncanny. Its readers wanted accounts that were true, yet truest when they seemed to resist explanation, modern and documented, and opening at once onto pure mystery. Later, when the pulp magazines took up the theme, restraint fell away entirely. A plain abandonment became a curse, a sea beast, an unseen slayer. The lonely hull on the horizon made a doorway into fantasy. Cinema, in its turn, invented nothing. It inherited a ready shape from generations of sailors and reporters, and beneath the music and the shadow, many of its phantom ships keep within them the skeleton of a true maritime record. Yet however dreadful a forsaken vessel appeared, someone was always obliged, in the end, to decide its fate. The law of the sea regarded such a hull not as a haunting but as a practical thing, a question of ownership, of hazard, of who held the right to board and tow and claim. A derelict was never a simple gift. Some accounts suggest that the finder might claim salvage, or, just as easily, find himself blamed. And so the courts had to ask hard things of every eerie silence. And it was the salvage crews who reached the cabins first, not historians nor magistrates, but practical men hunting tow lines and worth. They met the mystery at its freshest, before any retelling hardened around it, and became its first and least edited witnesses. In our own time, the work has changed. Most modern ghost ships are adrift hulls followed by satellite. their beacons calling faintly across the empty water, while the older silence drifts on through wire and wave alike. To stumble onto a ship stripped of everyone who had sailed her was never the tidy stroke of luck it seemed at first glance.
Coin might lie in it, yes, for any man able to coax such a hull back into port under the time-worn rules of salvage, a system by which one who found a wreck could lawfully take some portion of whatever the ocean had given up. Still, that very same statute could turn against him without mercy. A ship found empty was never just a present handed over. With equal ease, it could become a charge laid at one's feet. Reward of this kind always ran tangled together with peril. Setting foot on a strange deck meant courting flame in the hold, wood gone rotten and untrustworthy underfoot, illness clinging in the stale, enclosed air, freight liable to slide or catch fire, and swells running too violent to ferry anyone across without harm. And even once the labor was finished and the trophy hauled home, doubt followed close behind. Those in authority asked, first under their breath and afterward openly, whether the saviors had taken for themselves what belonged to others, meddled with some revealing trace, or made the wreckage seem grimmer than the truth allowed in order to fatten what they were owed. In more than a single renowned instance, the very crew who came across a phantom vessel quickly found a fog of gossip settling over them. A teaching sits tucked inside all of this. The puzzle of a vacant hull rarely shuts at the instant boots strike her boards. Far more often, that is the very place where it cracks open. Those who locate her are pulled into the account themselves, cheered as deliverers by one mouth and eyed as wrongdoers by the next. And so a forsaken ship carried twin burdens, the value reckoned in money, and a threat that could be reckoned only in tales. It possessed the strength to refashion the name and the fortune of whoever proved daring enough, or doomed enough, to lay hands on her ahead of all others. There existed a second danger, plainer and quicker to arrive. A hull set loose to roam stayed a menace to every craft still manned and held to a course. It was no mere riddle floating on the rollers, it was peril in motion. A massive derelict, sitting low and showing no lights, might smash into a vessel under sail, wreck a fishing ground, choke a sea lane, or rear up unannounced inside a bank of fog where the charts marked no obstruction. Ahead of the era of satellites, hulls of this sort drifted across long spans, their tracks beyond any guesswork. Even a humble boat gone unmanned could bring ruin should the current sweep it into thronged water. This blunt and bodily hazard accounts for a great deal of why officers along the coast and seafarers alike kept their eyes trained on these strays. They were never wonders alone. They were perils running free. A forsaken vessel could yet bear masts still upright, snarled rigging, splintered spars, or cargo wrenching loose in her belly, each piece turning a near approach into a gamble. Every so often the officials faced the choice of whether to haul such a drifter, to send her under, or to hold a careful watch over her until the threat had passed. Here rests one of the oddest twists in this chronicle. The chapter belonging to people had closed, and yet the ship kept on working its will upon the world. The object itself remained underway. These days the affair is milder in one regard, since most present-day derelicts, deserted and loose on the swell, are trailed over the broad ocean by satellite, their wandering hulls no longer quite so unbound to slip away or to startle. Well before the earliest sweep of radar grazed the skyline, it fell to the lighthouse and the signal post along the coast to first catch that something had gone awry with a ship passing by. Keepers pored over motion hour stacked upon hour. By long-worn instinct, they knew the manner in which a vessel should bear herself with a sure grip upon the wheel. A ship that drifted strangely, slid past her channel, hoisted no sign, or strayed too close to undoing, would pull their gaze in an instant. This handed the onlookers ashore an odd standing within the tale, since they frequently caught sight of the riddle before a single boot met the planking.
Out of a lamp room or a lofty post, they might watch a vessel wheel in unhurried rings, labor onward, or edge toward the stones with nothing replying from her decks or wheel. Sightings such as these bore a dread entirely theirs, for the ones who looked on could see the disaster mass and could not always stretch across the water to stay it. Many a regional legend took its first breath in precisely that powerless instant, with folk rooted on firm ground peering outward at a ship that looked alive enough to stir and yet empty enough to brush aside every warning the land was able to fling. A number of these wanderers never lingered out on the water at all. They struck the coast, and in striking it, they crossed forever into the recollection of a place. Once a deserted ship made landfall, the riddle grew tougher to lay aside, for it stopped belonging to seafarers by themselves. In a single stroke, entire communities could set their gaze upon it. A grounded or broken hull along a beach or reef turned into a fixture of the nearby world, and along with it came guesswork, remembrance, and unending retelling. Children were warned of it. Fishermen pointed their hands toward it. Travelers arrived inquiring after it. By that route did certain abandoned vessels slip clear of the maritime record and over into folklore. The coast granted them a permanence the open swell could never furnish. Out at sea, a strange ship might lift into view and melt away within one watch. On the land, it stayed long enough to gather stories about itself. Even once the breakers and the wreckers had ground the hull down to its bare ribs, the soil itself held on to the tale. A cove, a shoal, a forlorn stretch of shore could end up bearing the name of a ship that no one had ever genuinely fathomed. With the passing years, the facts shrank shorter and the mood ran deeper, until the vessel grew into something past the night she went down. It turned into a piece of the very disposition of that coast. Among warmer seas, the close arrived in another fashion, and softly. Not each phantom ship floated adrift for years. A few found their finish where coral lurked just under the gleaming surface, hushed and pitiless. A reef could split a hull wide, hold a ship fast in the cresting surf, or grip her tight until crew and cargo together were driven from her. Once that had happened, the unhurried toil of wiping away set in. Timber went soft and surrendered. Iron seeped into rust. Coral crept over fittings and beams, while fish slipped through cabins that had formerly held charts and the murmur of voices. Here lies one cause that so many accounts from reef-threaded waters dimmed before they had a chance to swell famous. The reef did not store its mysteries in the stark, preserving fashion that Arctic ice was held to. It melted them away. Yet something haunting dwells in that gentler ending too. Entire voyages were gathered up into living frameworks of stone and hue down in the shallows. History released them, but the ocean would not. In a handful of spots, divers in our day glide amid the bones of ships that once bore names and crews and far-flung destinations. Ships that have themselves turned into a portion of the reef. And wherever the current flowed, a forsaken vessel called for neither canvas nor steam to go on traveling. The planet on its own delivered the motion. The mighty ocean currents shift with a vast and leisurely force, threading highways that knit far coasts, gyres, and remote seas into one. The moment a ship lost her crew, those enormous systems could seize her entirely. A hull might float far past the waters where its troubles started, traversing seas no breathing soul on board had ever intended to reach. That stands as part of why such ships felt so eerie when at last they came into view. They surfaced in spots where they had no rightful place, carrying a buried past from some other district of the ocean. The currents fashioned them into messengers lacking any tongue. Mariners caught enough of these hidden roadways to stand in awe of them, though rarely enough to predict each roaming course. And that very doubt nourished the legend. A ship could appear to return from out of nowhere, when in plain fact, she had been journeying for months under the lone rule of wind and water. Nature held the wheel, and nature gave no reckoning of itself. Scarcely a quarter of the globe matched these tales the way the North Atlantic did. It teemed with commerce, was pounded by tempests, was laced with fog, and was held under currents able to ferry a drifting hull across staggering reaches. That blending rendered it a natural stage on which forsaken ships were discovered, dreaded, and remembered long after. A vessel might set out from Europe, from North America, or from the Caribbean, and still wind up roving lanes packed with other seafarers primed to catch sight of her. The traffic kept the stories drawing breath, and the conditions kept turning out fresh ones. Vile weather, ice piling along the rigging, the ever-looming threat of collision, and the plain length of the crossings each rendered abandonment possible. The North Atlantic grew into a corridor in which phantom ships were no scarce novelty, but a recurring likelihood. It is largely the same corridor that, within the modern era, bore the abandoned liner Lyubov Orlova adrift in 2013, a hull said to be teeming with rats, turned loose upon the very waters that had troubled mariners for hundreds of years. The ocean in that quarter did not simply devour ships. It wheeled them back around through human attention, sending vacant hulls into crowded waters where someone would, almost without fail, be waiting to stare. War spread its own brand of cruelty across the sea, since mines hit with no warning and frequently with no foe anywhere in view. A ship might be crossing water that appeared wholly clear when the explosion arrived, cleaving her hull, slaying those closest, and hurling the rest into dread. Even so, a mined vessel did not invariably founder straight away. At times she held on, maimed and streaming smoke, while her officers struggled to weigh injuries no one could safely set eyes upon in full. Was she sinking down? Did further mines lie in wait close by? Could the boats go over the side without sliding directly into a second blast? Doubt of that kind could push a crew to leave her before her real fate had ever been learned. What came of it was a fearful breed of phantom ship, one sired by modern war. The vessel held its place in clear sight, but every shred of trust in the water around her had bled off. Even a rescue carried danger. A ship left adrift after a mine had struck was not just abandoned, she was encircled by an unseen menace, and that turned each decision upon her deck into a bet staked against something concealed beneath the swell. During the era of canvas and rigging, a hush over the water came near to feeling otherworldly. A vessel under power throbs and trembles, its wiring giving off a faint murmur, and even when it lies idle, some mechanical pulse betrays that it lives. Sailing craft carried a wholly different range of sound, and that contrast bears on any thought of ghost ships. A sailing hull emptied of its people might grow unsettlingly still. There came no beat of an engine, no churn behind a turning screw, no deep pulse passing through the boards underfoot. All that lingered was the breeze threading through the lines, the lap of water along the planking, and at intervals the groan of timber bearing its load. Such noises are ordinary by nature, and yet, once severed from every trace of human toil, they can take on a quality that feels uncannily alive. A ship, after all, is fashioned to carry the sound of speech, of commands, of feet on deck and the labor of hands. Strip all of that away, and the quiet itself takes on a kind of weight. Here lies one cause for the dense, brooding mood of the early reports, even when no detail has been invented. Coming alongside an abandoned sailing ship meant entering a world that still went on moving, still seemed to draw breath, even though the human chorus that ought to have filled it was entirely absent. On a working ship, no one regarded the chronometer as mere decoration. Among the handful of devices that allowed a navigator to work out longitude, it was therefore one of the few capable of telling those aboard where, across the broad ocean, they genuinely lay. If such an instrument turned up missing from a derelict, the meaning changed in an instant. The thinking goes that a chronometer no longer aboard might point towards several possibilities. A measured exit into a little boat, A stealthy theft, a flash of fright, or a deliberate decision to bear the most valued aid to navigation away from a hull already given up as beyond rescue. That is the reason inquirers dwelt on what had gone as closely as on what stayed. A vanished sailor tells of grief. A vanished tool tells of decision. To the patient ear, it signals that someone might have made ready, might have meant to set off, to guide a course, to choose once the deck offered no more refuge. Read this way, the ship was not merely hollowed by mischance. It might have been quit with clear sight by those who hoped to bring time and bearing along with them into the unknown. Slight technical signs like these carry weight, since they make the feeling of it keener. The riddle lay never only in what was lost, but in what someone chose to remove when the ship could no longer be relied on to stay afloat. Even the labor of saving a vessel did not always suffice, for a great many of these roaming hulks refused to last. A ship might be spotted in one condition and gone in another before those salvaging her had wrapped up the work. By the time aid drew near, more than a few were scarcely holding on the surface. Water seeped through their seams. Masts rose weakened over rigging under strain. Long cold fire damage hid the decay of cracked timbers, and cargo that had slid pulled the whole thing crooked. The ocean, having lent a ship just enough life to appear ghostly, gave no assurance of holding her any further. So recovery turned into a chase after a mark that kept sliding away. Sailors might haul themselves aboard, set a tow, get the pumps going, and trust for a spell that the hull might reach harbor, only to see her sink lower, fill, and at last break up under their very grip. Such defeats spread one more hushed grief across these accounts. The vessel seemed to allow itself to be witnessed, yet would not allow itself to be kept. The rescue turned into another stretch of the mystery instead of its ending, and that final loss, coming at the very edge, only made the legend richer, the ship appearing to pull back the instant living hands shut around her. Superstition collected wherever proof scattered more swiftly than recollection could grasp it. The sea keeps records poorly and undoes them without rest. It strews planks about, fades the painted lettering, draws the dead below, and shatters straightforward events into pieces with a quickness that startles. When the proof slips away at such speed, fancy wanders in to occupy the empty corners. A cracked spar drifts up onto the beach. A boat turns up floating with no one in it. The name a ship bore lasts beyond the logbook she kept. Within that space between what occurred and any confirmation of it, tales multiply. Was she under a curse? A few would wonder. Had warning come and been ignored? Did some silent sign go by unnoticed? These convictions amounted to no simple foolishness. Far more often, they were attempts to set a measure of order over a world that wiped order away nearly the moment it formed. Recollection lasted beyond any driftwood, and so recollection set about, softly, to refashion the loss. Here is why such lore took on such depth. The water bore off the solid facts, but spared just enough, and just enough time as well, for the mind to carry on its labor. Ashore, a calamity usually leaves behind its traces. Those who saw it, the edges of the scene, the items that may be collected and named. Roads lead toward someplace. Walls remain where masons set them. Out on the water, all of this comes undone, since the stage itself never stops shifting. The wind veers. Currents take objects a long way off. One storm clears the record inside hours, and even the people who lived through it may be born leagues away from where it started. The sea, then, proves oddly loyal in keeping a mystery. It wrecks the proof while holding the emotional outline of the thing entire. A nearer study shows only that a ship was discovered stripped of her crew, or seen drifting well after she had been abandoned, never the whole chain that brought it about. Each forsaken hull, so it seems, bore a pair of stories together, the one true, the other dreamed up. The first is the property of history, put together out of weather and freight and course, out of crew and harm and the decisions reached in a rush. That telling may remain forever unfinished, yet it is the one that thoughtful minds set out to piece back together. The second starts almost within the same instant, spun from rumor, from dread, from the long-standing cultural way of accounting for what the sea would not account for. The pair move side by side. Now and then they prop each other up, now and then they break apart, until the one stiffens into legend and the other settles unseen in arid reports. By some readings, we register both together. The genuine peril that may have played out over those boards, and the broader dreamed life the vessel assumed once quiet had descended. In the present era, the scales have tilted somewhat. The Lyubov Orlova, a weary cruise liner set loose for the breakers, parted from her tow during the winter of 2013 and drifted across the North Atlantic on her own, followed for a while by news and gossip, claimed by some to be peopled with nothing but rats. These days, most wandering hulls are no longer genuinely missing. The emergency signals they send, the EPIRB transmitters, reach the satellites passing above, and a forsaken ship can be observed from a great distance as she travels over barren seas. Yet the ocean, even so, holds on to its ancient gift. It stays loyal enough to keep a mystery, and unfeeling enough to leave just enough behind to hold one lone question open, perhaps without end. And so the lanterns dim, one by one, along a shore we will not name. The ships we have followed tonight are still out there in the mine's gray water, sails set, decks bare, going wherever the current chooses. You need not follow them any farther. There is no harbor left to reach, no riddle still asking to be solved, no watch left for you to keep. Let the names loosen and float free. Let the fog close softly over every empty deck. The sea keeps its own counsel, as it always has, and it asks nothing of you but rest. Breathe in, slow and deep. Breathe out, slower still. Let the swell rock you down, fathom by gentle fathom, into the quiet below thought. The voyage is over now. The water is calm. Sleep well and drift easy, and let the night carry you the rest of the way.